Hello everyone, and welcome to the Cut Rate Commander Halloween Special, an extra episode for the series in which we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and in celebration of the spookiest of seasons, we'll be looking at the black half of Innistrads' reanimation siblings, Gisa glorious Resurrector. Before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. And if you're feeling particularly generous, feel free to buy me a coffee at the link in the description to keep me caffeinated as I work on more of these builds. So with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Gisa Glorious Resurrector is a 4/4 human wizard that costs 2 and double black with the following abilities. If a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. At the beginning of your upkeep, put all creature cards exiled with Gisa Glorious Resurrector onto the battlefield under your control. They gain decayed. So Gisa is packing a pretty standard mid-sized body and stat block to match, alongside a set of abilities that work very well together to steal our opponent's creatures when they die, albeit temporarily. Her first ability is straightforward enough, exiling any creatures that die under our opponent's control to deny any death triggers they may have and preventing reanimation, providing a decent amount of disruption on its own for any graveyard-focused build while not affecting our own grave in the slightest. This leads nicely into her second ability, which returns all those creatures back into play under our control, though now they'll be sporting the decayed keyword, which makes them quite fragile. Still, we're going to benefit from any ETB triggers these creatures may have, and even get any death triggers that would have been denied to our opponents. And while they can't block and die at the end of combat if they attack, it's still a free body that we're getting at no cost to us. Critically, however, our commander actually needs to stay alive all the way until our upkeep for her to resurrect our opponent's creatures, even if she leaves play temporarily, such as with effects that reanimate upon death. Since this is technically a new instance of the card, the creatures exiled previously with her effect will just remain exiled, so do keep that in mind. Taking all that into consideration, it looks like our commander wants us to focus on getting our opponent's creatures to die on the battlefield so she can bring them back as temporary fodder, taking advantage of any abilities they may have when they enter the battlefield, then send them off to their graves again after swinging in with them. And while regular single target removal works okay to accomplish this, why just settle for a single target when we can instead take creatures from all our opponents? To accomplish this, we'll be focusing on running as many AoE edict effects as we can get our hands on, which not only gives us a means to proc our commander continuously as our opponents have to sack their creatures, but also bypasses any annoying defenses they may have, such as indestructible, hexproof, and regenerate, to name a few. And as our commander brings back the shambling corpses of our opponent's creatures, we can take advantage of their newly decayed state by including lots of payoffs for when they eventually fall apart on us, forgoing the need for traditional sack outlets as our creatures will be able to sacrifice themselves, and giving us typical black death triggers like card advantage and life drain. But just because our creatures can sack themselves doesn't mean we can't take advantage of sack effects to get extra value out of them before they die. So we'll be running a number of sack outlets that we can use at instant speed between our creatures attacking and the end of combat to get extra value out of them before they crumble away on their own. Finally, we'll need to make sure that our commander's properly protected, since she's such an important part of the deck and our opponents will certainly be gunning for her to prevent their creatures from being turned against them. That means we'll be running a decent number of ways to make Gisa indestructible, untargetable, or regenerate her, allowing us to keep her on the field for longer to continue reanimating our opponent's creatures. Now, let's get this reunion underway. Our opponent's old creatures have gotten themselves all spruced up for this occasion after all, getting all that grave dirt off themselves, though there's not a whole lot they could have done about that smell. I hope our opponents are as happy to see them as they are. After all, their creatures are just dying to see them again. So now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Skipping right to the CMC2 slot, we have a pair of humans joining us with Zulaport Cutthroat and Priest of the Forgotten Gods. Zulaport Cutthroat is a 1/1 who, whenever a creature we control dies, has our opponents lose 1 life while we gain 1 life, taking advantage of our reanimated creature's fragile states to drain our opponent's life as they inevitably crumble back to the grave. Priest of the Forgotten Gods is a 1/2 who we can tap and sack 2 other creatures to have any number of target players lose 2 life and sack a creature, while we generate 2 black mana and draw a card, getting us extra use from our decayed friends by inflicting life loss and an edict on our opponents while ramping us and getting us card advantage. The CMC3 slot then starts us off with a whole host of AoE edict effects, those being Plaguecrafter, Demon's Disciple, Fleshbag Marauder, and Merciless Executioner, all 4 having all players sack a creature when they ETB, the first hitting planeswalkers as well and forcing a discard if nothing was sacked, the second one also hitting planeswalkers, and the last 2 having no additional effects, all serving as a means to get as many of our opponent's creatures into the bin as possible to then be brought back with our commander. Then as we move deeper into this slot, we get to some of our death payoffs with Morbid Opportunist, Grim Haruspex, and Pawn of Ulamog. Morbid Opportunist and Grim Haruspex both draw us cards as creatures die, the former being a 1/3 and triggering when any creature dies but only once per turn, while the latter is a 3/2 that only triggers when our own non-token creatures die and has more for a black, both generating us some solid card advantage as our creatures die off. Pawn of Ulamog is a 2/2 that creates a 0/1 token that can sack itself to generate a colorless mana whenever it or another non-token we control dies, spawning lots of little bodies for us that we can screen attacks with and sack at instant speed to trigger other death effects that are not non-token dependent. Then we close out this slot with Murderous Rider and Burnished Heart. Murderous Rider is a 2/3 lifelinker that sends itself to the bottom of our deck when it dies and that we can play for its adventure side, that being Swift End, an instant that costs 1 and double black to destroy target creature or planeswalker while costing us 2 life, serving as both a good removal spell initially, which later gives us an okay defensive body as a bonus. Burnished Heart is a 2/2 that we can pay 3 and sack to put 2 basic lands from our deck into play tapped, giving us some good land-based ramp in a color that has very limited access to such things. Moving on to the CMC4 slot, we have some more AoE Edict effect creatures joining us with Slum Reaper, Eradicator Valkyrie, and Rankle, Master of Pranks. Slum Reaper is a 4/2 who has everyone sack a creature when it ETBs, giving us yet another AoE Edict effect to quickly kill our opponent's creatures and enable our commander. Eradicator Valkyrie is a 4/3 flyer with lifelink and hexproof from planeswalkers that can boast for 1 a black and sacrificing a creature, forcing all our opponents to sack a creature as well, making it a good evasive body with other relevant keywords that we can use as a repeatable source of edict removal. Rankle is a 3/3 flyer with haste that, whenever it deals combat damage, lets us choose any number of the following effects. Each player discards a card, each player loses 1 life and draws a card, and or each player sacrifices a creature, making him another evasive body, this one being able to get in quickly for more edict removal or even hand disruption or draw if needed. More death payoffs then join us with Falconwrath Noble, Sifter of Skulls, and Vindictive Vampire. Falconwrath Noble is a 2/2 flyer that, whenever it or another creature dies, has target player lose a life while we gain a life, giving us a targetable drain effect when we need to start focusing down someone in specific's life total. Sifter of Skulls is a 4/3 that creates a 1/1 token that can sack itself to produce a colorless mana whenever another non-token we control dies, making it the upgraded version of Pawn of Ulamog that has bigger stats and produces bigger tokens that we can sack for more mana and more death triggers. Vindictive Vampire is a 2/3 that, whenever another creature we control dies, has all our opponents lose a life while we gain a life, this time being a bigger version of Zulaport Cutthroat and, like them, giving us some good AoE drain that's not limited to non-tokens. 2 more death payoffs are then added to our ranks with Smothering Abomination and Erebos Bleakhearted. Smothering Abomination is a 4/3 flyer with Devoid that, on our upkeep, has a sacrifice a creature and also draws us a card whenever we sacrifice a creature, making it a respectable flyer that gives us card advantage every time a creature dies to decay or due to being sacked from our other edict effects. Erebos is a 5/6 enchantment creature with Indestructible that isn't a creature unless our devotion to black is 5+, lets us pay 2 life whenever another creature we control dies to draw a card, and lets us pay 1 a black and sack another creature to give target creature -2/-1 until end of turn, serving as a source of card advantage and sack outlet initially that we can turn into a huge hard to deal with beatstick once our devotion climbs up high enough. Then we reach the end of this slot with Dread Presence, a 3/3 that, whenever we play a swamp, either lets us draw a card and lose a life, or deal 2 damage to any target and gain 2 life, pulling its weight as a card advantage and drain source considering we're a mono-black deck and running quite a few swamps. Entering the CMC5 slot, we have a pair of entrants joining us with Sir Conrad the Grim and Archfiend of Depravity. Sir Conrad the Grim is a 5/4 that, whenever another creature dies, goes to the grave from anywhere or leaves the grave, deals 1 damage to each opponent, in addition to letting us pay 1 in a black to mill everyone for 1, making him a pretty beefy body with another death-based damage effect for us to take advantage of, while also having a mana sink that can get us some additional damage in if we happen to have some mana open. Archfiend of Depravity is another 5/4, this time with flying, that has each opponent, on their end step, choose up to 2 creatures they control, then sack the rest, being more than capable of devastating our opponent's boards if left unchecked, while also possessing a good evasive body to swing in with. The CMC6 slot then brings us its single entry with Harvester of Souls, a 5/5 Death Toucher that lets us draw a card whenever a non-token creature dies, providing us with even more card advantage as our creatures die while having a pretty beefy stat block and a scary keyword to boot. Finally, reaching the CMC7 slot, we have our last creature with Butcher of Malakir, a 5/4 flyer that, whenever it or another creature we control dies, has each opponent sack a creature, turning all our decayed bodies into removal as they crumble and generating us even more bodies in a vicious cycle so long as it sticks around. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instance. Starting in the CMC1 slot, we have Village Rites, which has a sack a creature to draw 2, making it a cheap draw spell that we can cast on our decayed creatures after they attack but before combat ends to get extra value out of them. The CMC2 slot then brings us a whole lot of removal, starting with Cast Down, Doomblade, and Go for the Throat, all 3 of which destroy a creature, the first being limited to non-legendaries, the second to non-black creatures, and the last to non-artifacts, all being very cheap and, despite their restrictions, still being able to deal with a wide variety of targets. Victim of the Night and Heartless Act also join this removal suite, the former destroying a non-werewolf, non-vampire, non-zombie creature, and the latter destroying a creature that has no counters on it, or removing 3 counters from that creature instead, adding yet more ways to snipe out specific creatures we want to reanimate when our opponents refuse to sack them. Then we close out this slot with Liliana's Triumph and Plumb the Forbidden. Liliana's Triumph has each opponent sack a creature, while also discarding a card if we control a Liliana Planeswalker, which we don't, still serving perfectly well as an instant speed AoE edict effect that leaves our board state untouched. Plumb the Forbidden has us draw a card and lose a life, allowing us to sack any number of creatures to copy this effect for each. Again, letting us get extra value out of our decayed creatures or perhaps our board state if we were to lose it to a wipe and would rather turn it into card advantage instead. Moving on to the CMC3 slot, we have its 3 entries with Soul Shatter, Vana's Hunger, and Force of Despair. Soul Shatter has each opponent sack a creature or planeswalker they control with the highest CMC, again giving us another AoE edict effect, this one forcing our opponents to give us their most expensive creature instead of the smaller ones they would rather give us. Vana's Hunger has each opponent sack a creature, or, if we have the City's Blessing, has them sack half of their creatures rounded up instead, being fine initially but utterly devastating if we have the City's Blessing to partially wipe our opponent's board for later reanimation, all at instant speed. Force of Despair destroys all creatures that enter the battlefield this turn and lets us exile a black card from our hand to cast it rather than pay its cost if it's not our turn, serving as a potent response to an opponent going off by summoning multiple creatures on their turn, and can catch them completely off guard when we're tapped out, all at the cost of a single card from our hand. Then we skip to the CMC5 slot and our last instant with Sazat's Will, which has us choose one of the following effects, or both if we control our commander. Each opponent sacks a creature they control with the highest power, or exile all cards from all opponents' graves and create X01 tokens, X being equal to the power of the biggest creature exiled this way, capping off our instant speed AoE edict effects with one that limits our opponent's options on what they can sack and doubles up as a graveyard hate card that provides us with extra bodies for us to use as a bonus. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. Skipping straight to the CMC2 slot, we have its 2 entrants with Mire in Misery and Sign in Blood. Mire in Misery has each opponent sack a creature or enchantment, giving us another cheap AoE edict effect, though this one is able to hit enchantments, which our color's usually unable to do. Sign in Blood has target player draw 2 and lose 2 life, making it a good standalone draw spell that we can occasionally turn into burn if we need that extra reach to close out a game. The CMC3 slot then brings us another pair of entrants with Virtus's Maneuver and Read the Bones. Virtus's Maneuver has a select friend or foe for each player, each friend returning a creature from their grave to their hand, while each foe sacks a creature they control instead, usually resulting in a recursion for us and an edict for our opponents, but can be used to leverage negotiations when applicable. Read the Bones has a Scry 2, Draw 2, and Lose 2 life, providing us with a card selection and card draw source for negligible life loss, which we'll gladly run. The CMC4 slot then changes to a single entry one with Diabolic Tutor, which has us search our deck for a card and adds it to our hand, giving us a non-conditional tutor effect that search up anything we may need without having to reveal it to our opponents. The CMC5 slot then switches to a pair of entrants again, this time featuring Siphon Flesh and Dance Macabre. Siphon Flesh has each opponent sack a creature and then creates a 2/2 zombie token for us for each creature sacrificed this way, granting us yet another AoE edict effect, this one also generating us board presence in the process. Dance Macabre has each player sack a non-token creature, then has us roll a d20, adding the toughness of the creature we sacked to the result. On a 1 through 14, we get one of the creatures sacked this way back into play under our control, and on a 15+, we put 2 back instead, again serving as another edict effect that can get us to trade up to a permanent copy of an opponent's creature, or 2 if we get lucky. Finally reaching the CMC6 slot, we have our last sorcery with Reign of the Pit, which has each player sack a creature, then creates an XX Flying Demon token, X being equal to the total power of all sacked creatures. This edict effect also hitting us, but creating a mid-sized to huge evasive body in the process, which is a fair trade-off. That covers all our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. Starting off in the CMC1 slot, we have Empiric Rites, which lets us pay 1, a black, and sack a creature to draw a card and gain a life, making it a cheap instant speed and repeatable sack effect to get extra value out of our decayed creatures continually throughout the course of the game. Then the CMC2 slot brings us a pair of entrants with Ghoulish Procession and a Dark Privilege. Ghoulish Procession creates a 2/2 zombie token with decay for us whenever a non-token creature dies, limited to once per turn, giving us even more bodies to swing into our opponents with as our own and their creatures die for additional board pressure. Dark Privilege is an aura that gives the enchanted creature +1/+1 and lets us sacrifice another creature to regenerate it, providing us with a solid form of protection to keep our commander alive through removal and wipes while also serving as a sack outlet if needed. The top half of the CMC3 slot then gives us some Death Matters payoffs with Bastion of Remembrance and Blight Mound. Bastion of Remembrance creates a 1/1 token when it ETBs, and whenever a creature we control dies, has each opponent lose a life while we gain a life. giving us yet another AoE drain effect that procs off of any of our creatures dying, this time as a back row piece which is much harder for our opponents to interact with. Blight Mound gives all attacking pests +1/+0 and menace, while also, whenever a non-token creature we control dies, creating a 1/1 pest token that has, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life, generating us more board presence and potential life gain as our creatures get sacked, along with an OK Anthem for said tokens. The bottom half of this slot then gives us a pair of ways to protect our commander with Blessing of Leeches and Soul Channeling, both being auras that let us regenerate the enchanted creature, the former being castable at flash speed and regenerating for no mana cost, but losing us 1 life on our upkeep, while the latter regenerates the enchanted creature for the cost of 2 life, both providing us with manaless ways to keep our commander alive through destruction-based removal and wipes. Skipping to the CMC5 slot, we come to our last trio of enchantments with Gift of Doom, the Eldest Reborn, and Open the Graves. Gift of Doom is an aura that grants the enchanted creature Death Touch and Indestructible, as well as having Morph by sacking another creature, which will always be playing for its Morph cost to sack a creature and immediately make our commander incredibly difficult to interact with through most conventional means. The Eldest Reborn is a saga whose first chapter has all our opponents sack a creature, whose second chapter then has them discard a card, and finally lets us reanimate a creature under our control from any graveyard, pulling double duty as both an AoE edict and later a means to permanently bring back an opponent's creature under our control or one of ours if we wish to instead. Open the Graves creates a 2/2 zombie token whenever one of our non-token creatures die, making it an upgraded version of Ghoulish Procession that creates sturdier zombies much more often for better board presence generation. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. The CMC1 slot opens up with Soul Ring and Wayfarer's Bauble, both being excellent sources of ramp, the former tapping for 2 colorless, and the latter letting us pay 2, tap it and sack it to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, both hitting the board early and helping us ramp quickly into our commander and edict effects. The CMC2 slot then gives us more rocks with Arcane Signet, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Charcoal Diamond, which comes into play tapped and taps for a black, Mind Stone, which taps for a colorless and we can pay 1, tap it and sack it to draw a card, and Prismatic Lens, which also taps for a colorless and we can pay 1 to filter a mana. Then last in the slot, we're running a pair of equipment with Ring of Zathrid and Swiftfoot Boots. Ring of Zathrid equips for 1, regenerates the equipped creature for 2, and puts a +1/+1 counter on it on our upkeep if it's black, serving as another way to keep our commander alive while growing her steadily over time. Swiftfoot Boots also equips for 1, this time granting the equipped creature hexproof and haste, providing Gisa with some targeted removal protection as well as the means to get into combat quickly. Finally, the CMC3 slot closes out our artifacts with Commander's Sphere, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity and we can sack to draw a card, making it a typical mana rock with upside, and Crowded Crypt, which taps for a black, gets a charge counter on it every time a creature we control dies, and we can pay 4, double black, tap it and sack it to create 2/2 zombie tokens with decay for each charge counter on it, giving us a passable mana rock initially that slowly becomes a ticking time bomb as more and more of our creatures die, enabling us to create a huge amount of board presence all at once, all on our opponent's turn. That covers all our artifacts, and since we have no planeswalkers in this build, let's skip straight to the land base. Starting with our mana lands, we have only a single entry with Myriad Landscape, which comes into play tapped, taps for a colorless, and we can pay 2, tap it and sack it to put 2 of the same basic land from our deck into play tapped for some additional ramp. Moving on to our utility lands, we'll start off with Bajuga Bog, Ghost Quarter, and Tyrite Sanctum. Bajuga Bog comes into play tapped, taps for a black, and when it ETBs, exiles target player's graveyard, giving us a good source of player-specific graveyard hate from our land slot. Ghost Quarter taps for a colorless and we can tap it and sack it to destroy target land, letting its owner replace it with a basic from their deck, serving as a good way to pick off our opponent's utility lands. Tyrite Sanctum also taps for a colorless and either lets us pay 2 and tap it to change target legendary creature into a god and give it a +1/+1 counter, or instead pay 4, tap it and sack it to put an indestructible counter on target god, serving as another way to protect our commander, this time from the land slot. Then we close out our utility lands with Hostile and High Market. Hostile taps for a colorless and we can pay 1, tap it and sack a creature to put a soul counter on it at sorcery speed, transforming it into creeping in when it gets 3+ counters on it, a 3/7 that lets us exile a creature from our grave whenever it attacks to have each opponent lose X life while we gain X life, with X being equal to the amount of creatures exiled with it, as well as having the ability to phase out for 4, giving us a somewhat slow but cheap sack outlet immediately from the land slot that turns into a huge body that weaponizes our graveyard to drain out our opponents and can even protect itself from removal and wipes. High Market taps for a colorless and we can tap it and sack a creature to gain 1 life, serving as another sack outlet from our land slot for more death triggering and life gain. Lastly, we're running 29 swamps as our basics to fill out our land base. So now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. This deck currently has 25 creatures including the commander, 12 instants, 8 sorceries, 10 enchantments, 10 artifacts, 0 planeswalkers, and 35 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 20 AoE edict effects, 18 cards that care about creatures dying, 8 sack outlets, 3 one-time sack outlets, and 7 sources of protection against removal, leaving us with plenty of ways to force our opponents to sack their creatures to enable our commander, payoffs for when our decayed creatures die, ways to sack them ourselves for additional value, and plenty of ways to keep our commander alive to ensure we can reanimate those creatures in the first place. For general deck stats, we have 13 ramp sources, 13 card draw sources, 28 single target removal sources, and 2 board wipes. Our single target removal being well above normal due to the sheer amount of edict effects we're running, while our ramp, draw, and wipes remain at standard numbers. Looking at our mana curve, we have 4 1-drops, 19 2-drops, 20 3-drops, 11 4-drops, 8 5-drops, 2 6-drops, and 1 7-drop. Giving us an early to mid-game curve that aims to get our commander on board as soon as possible and begin killing our opponent's creatures for value with efficient removal and AoE edict effects, and then turning them on their former masters in turn. Currently, this deck is valued at $64.56, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For side grades, more edict effects can be added if you find the build lacking, such as Abyssal Gatekeeper, Innocent Blood, and Barter and Blood to help cause further casualties on our opponent's board states. More death payoffs such as Dark Prophecy, Black Market, and Thieving Amalgam could also find a home here, giving us additional draw, ramp, and drain respectively as our creatures continue to die. If, however, we're looking to take permanent control of our opponent's creatures, Cyanide Sanctum, Cold Storage, and Conjurer's Closet all allow us to exile our opponent's creatures once we steal them, then return them back into play under our control without decay, putting them under our employ forever instead of just temporarily. For upgrades, Dictate of Erebos and Grave Pact both cause our opponents to sack even more creatures as our creatures die. Blood Artist, Bantu's Monument, and Cryptghast all provide us with additional drain effects to deal even more damage to our opponents while padding out our own life totals, while Archon of Cruelty and Sheoldred Whispering One both make good top ends to sack even more of our opponent's creatures. Finally, the Meathook Massacre serves as both a wipe and a death payoff to drain our opponent's life totals that much quicker, but we'll have to pay a premium to get this new card off the lot. Gotta pay for that new card smell after all. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. I hope you folks enjoyed the extra Halloween treat and hope you have a very safe and happy Halloween. Before we close out, again, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel can't grow without your support. And if you feel like showing your thanks by keeping me caffeinated while I do these videos, feel free to buy me a coffee at the link in the description. Also feel free to check out the other deck techs floating around my head if you want to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the Cut Rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.